Good morning very much, Pak Elan, Pak Bang Bang, Ibu Fleur, honorable guests, colleagues from all over the world. It's a great privilege to be up here and to have this opportunity to talk to you. I do want to emphasize what Ibu Fleur said in her introduction, that we do not feel that the expertise around this question in social protection and employment is up here behind this barrier of flowers. We feel it's out there amongst all of you. And so I want to stress that what I'm hoping to achieve this morning is not to give you any answers. It's really to set the scene so that you are able to give us the answers, so that by the end of this workshop, we are in a much more knowledgeable position than we are now. And I think that's very important. And for the rest of the 2 days after this opening session, we're going to be working very much in conversational mode so that we learn from you everything that you bring to this meeting. So this is really what I hope to cover in the next half hour or so. Why are we here? What are we talking about? Why does it matter? What can be done? How can we do it? And why are we doing this through a knowledge jam? So this knowledge exchange is part of a process that is to explore the linkages between social protection and employment. As we've heard, it's contracted through Australian DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, implemented by its social protection hub here in Indonesia. And we have 3 main outputs from this particular piece of work. The first one is this SouthSouth knowledge exchange, which is co-hosted by TNP2K and supported by GIZ. As a result of this, we hope to produce a guidance note on the subject of linking social protection and employment opportunities. And finally, and this is an area that Kate will be talking to you about, we hope to make this the start of a process that leads to further action, that builds a community in this area, and that will become a dynamic force as we move forward from this event. So what are we talking about here? We need to set the ground rules, the definitions. What we've adopted here is the DFAT definition of social protection, which is a relatively narrow one. There are as many different definitions of social protection as there are people in this room, I'm quite sure. We've used the DFAT one, which is publicly funded initiatives that provide regular and predictable cash or in-kind transfers to individuals, families, and households to reduce poverty and vulnerability and foster resilience and empowerment. We also need to understand that when we talk about employment, we're not just talking about formal wage employment, but also about informal self-employment, otherwise known as own account, entrepreneurship, or enterprise. And I think we have to have in the back of our minds that we should be working towards a concept of decent work, that just providing jobs is not enough. We have to be providing decent work, which the ILO defines as being opportunities for women and men to obtain decent and productive work in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. Okay, so why does this topic matter? Why are we gathered here to discuss this? Well, I think it's fairly clear that the best way for households to extricate themselves from poverty is through decent work, so that maximizing the opportunities for employment and ensuring its quality should be the primary objectives of any government. The more households are able to engage productively with the labor market, the less will be their requirement for social protection. But we also have to recognize that social protection will always have an essential role to play in supporting employment. And the reason for that is that there are 3 kinds of eventuality which make it essential to have social protection as a fallback. There are some stages of the life course where full employment is inappropriate or becomes more difficult. Infancy, childhood, old age, maternity. There are also, in most countries, periodic, cyclical, or seasonal downturns when employment opportunities diminish. There is not as much work to go around. And finally, there are specific shocks which make it impossible for an individual to work, either in terms of personal injury, chronic illness or disability, care responsibilities, or in a broader sense of natural disasters which prevent people from working. So we need social protection, and social protection should be designed to encourage and support full employment, avoiding disincentives to work. Now, when I began to prepare this whole study and this particular presentation, I looked at the literature, and there seemed to be a typology emerging of the kinds of ways in which social protection interacts with employment. And I began with these 4 different categories, if you like, 4 different types. The first one is where Lifecourse social protection has spillover effects on employment. The second area is social protection that actually provides employment, in particular through public work schemes, for example, through employment guarantee schemes. The third area is social protection that supports self-employment. So we're talking here about the kind of asset transfers, livelihoods programs, sometimes known as graduation programs, providing packages of support to enable people to have their own enterprises. And then a fourth category is around social protection that increases the employability of individuals through training, through childcare, through support with job search. And I'm going to go through them one by one, and I want to ask these questions. In terms of Lifecourse social protection that has spillover effects on employment, is this enough? In terms of social protection that provides employment, is this really the kind of employment that we want? In terms of social protection that supports self-employment, is this a realistic aspiration? Is this something we can really expect governments to be adopting on a substantial scale? And finally, social protection that increases employability. Is this really social protection? And so if we look at each one of these in turn, I think it's clear to all of us that there is inevitably an interaction between good social protection and the labor market. If we look at a table like this, we can look at the different Lifecourse stages, and we can see how good social protection at those particular Lifecourse stages can have positive impacts on the labor market, on employment. So that providing social protection through pregnancy and infancy, especially during those first critical 1,000 days, you will end up with a more intelligent workforce. If you link social protection to improving education, as we've heard through BSM, for example, in Indonesia, you end up with a better educated, more productive workforce. If you provide better training to youth and adolescents, you will end up with a more effective, more appropriate, more suitable workforce. If you provide support through social protection at working age, you will bring better health, which produces a healthier, more productive workforce. If you increase the income of individuals through social transfers, you will get a more mobile, more enterprising workforce, readier to look for work, readier to stay in work. And if you provide that guaranteed, regular source of income through social protection at the working age, you will have a less risk-averse workforce who are more prepared to engage in higher risk but higher return activities. In old age, if you provide, for example, a social pension, you will be putting less pressure on those elderly people to continue working. That produces more opportunities for employment, amongst others, more demand, higher wages potentially. If you make those elderly people available for childcare, you allow mothers to return to the workforce. And finally, if you have programs which help persons with disabilities to enter the workforce, you have a more inclusive, more diverse workforce. So in all of these areas, we see that providing social protection has an impact on the labor market and on employment potential. But is this really what we want to be focusing on in this workshop? These are obviously hugely important impacts, but they act over the long term, even intergenerationally. And we got the feeling when we were talking to you, to all of you, in the run-up to this workshop, that what we're more interested in at this stage is a shorter-term focus on how the working age beneficiaries of social protection programs can be persuaded more quickly into decent work. So a more immediate, more targeted, shorter term focus. And I think that's what we're going to be focusing on over the next 2 days. We recognize the longer term impacts of social protection in general, but our focus here is much more on the linkages between those people who are receiving social transfers of one kind or another and how to get those people employed. Now, the other 3 types, which I'm also going to talk about briefly here, have very valuable lessons in this regard, but I don't think they in themselves are the solution that we're looking for. If we move on, social protection that provides employment. So we have a number of labor-based programs operating in a number of different countries in the world whose primary objective is to provide a social transfer on a seasonal basis. Now, these are sometimes called productive safety nets. They're also called workfare. Officially, they are presented as having 4 big advantages. First of all, they're not giving beneficiaries something for nothing, and therefore they avoid dependency. They provide a win-win combination of a transfer, but also the creation of productive assets. They appeal politically because they can impart skills to the workforce. And they solve the problem of targeting by being self-targeted. However, in reality, all of those 4 advantages can be questioned and have been questioned. I'm not going to get drawn into that discussion now. It's something we can explore in more detail. But I think what's critical is that nowhere is it the intention of public works to provide long-term, decent work. They are a short-term measure, which I think we should treat as being a condition to receiving a cash transfer. And there is exactly the same requirement as with other types of social transfer to move people off public works programs and into longer-term, decent work opportunities. And we see that on a number of the more innovative public works programs, such as the Productive Safety Net in Ethiopia. We see this attempt to link the participation in the public works with the opportunities to develop enterprises, to enter the labor market, to access microcredit and so on. And I think that's how we should look at public works, not as a means of providing employment, but as another type of social transfer which is seeking to move people into decent work. Social protection that supports self-employment. Over the last decade or so, we've seen a big impetus to this graduation approach, which combines support for immediate needs with promoting sustainable livelihoods in the future. This provides intensive but very expensive support to individual households. And it's based on 5 key building blocks. It selects the very poorest, it provides consumption support, it supports financial inclusion, it provides an asset transfer in one form or another, and it provides skills training through regular coaching. This is an approach that was pioneered by BRAC since 2002 and has since been piloted in a number of countries other than Bangladesh. There have been rigorous evaluations of these programs and generally positive results. But again, I think there are questions about this in terms of the topic that we are discussing. This concept of a one-way crossing of a threshold out of poverty is flawed. People don't move out of poverty and not fall back. Life is not like that. So there is this fundamental flaw about the idea of lifting people to one point and then leaving them on their own 2 feet. I think there's also a problem in the context that we're talking about, that the focus on the very poorest is in conflict with the objective of developing enterprise. There is no indication as yet that governments will adopt this model on a large scale for 2 reasons. One is the reason of cost, that these are expensive programs. The other is the question of equity, is that they focus huge resources on a very small number of households and ignore a large number of others. So I think the suggestion is that it would be better to offer these kinds of programs as one component of a more comprehensive social protection program and focus it on those households which really have more enterprise potential. And I think in that context, we have learned a lot of very valuable lessons from the experiences of these graduation programs. Okay, and on the question of social protection that increases employability. Okay, providing people financial inclusion, cash for training, linking social protection to vocational training, special programs for persons with disabilities, childcare which can work both ways. Either you can provide childcare to social protection beneficiaries, which will free them up to take labor opportunities, or you can use public works programs to provide more of a social function by using public works not to build roads, but to provide social services to others, including childcare. And job search support, so helping people with the process of finding where the work is, making them aware of the opportunities that exist. So I think, again, we see some very valuable lessons from a number of programs. A number of those are represented here, and we will look forward to learning from them. But is this really social protection? And I just want to digress for a minute to discuss what I think is a slight danger here, the risk of loading too much onto social protection. Now, a few years ago, a couple of colleagues and I decided that social protection had a lot in common with a very popular children's book that was around when we were young. We're all quite elderly, so this was a long time ago. And this is a story about Thidwick, the big-hearted moose. And the thing about Thidwick is that he was asked by a little bug if the little bug could hitch a ride on his antlers. And Thidwick, being a big-hearted moose, said, yes, of course. The trouble was that more people started asking him. But other animals start to join this bug on the moose's antlers. Until finally, a bear and a fox and 369 bees or something like that all take refuge on the antlers of this moose. And what happens is that he collapses. Okay? And I think there's a danger of something similar happening with social protection. Social protection is meant to help and support the poorest and more vulnerable at crucial times. If we start to ask social protection also to help educate people, to provide better health, to provide better nutrition, to contribute to economic growth, to increase employability, to contribute to social cohesion, nation building, it's going to collapse just like Thidwick. So I think we have to be very careful when we're talking about this. And I think what we have to be focusing on over these next couple of days is how do we build more proactively the necessary linkages between social protection and other programs, many of which are happening in countries in any case. But we need to make better linkages. And I think that's a focus that we would like to concentrate on over the remainder of this event. Okay, so what can be done? Well, this workshop brings together a range of experience in all of those broad topic areas that I've just discussed, those 4 different types of social protection. We have a whole range of participants in conditional cash transfers, in broader social protection systems, in public works programs, livelihoods programs, in childcare, vocational training, programs for people with disabilities, microfinance, and more. So there is plenty of opportunity here. We also have a lot of experience of the kind of integration that I'm talking about, which comes from programs in Latin America. And we're very fortunate to have representatives from a number of countries in Latin America where these kinds of initiatives have been beginning to happen over the last few years. From El Salvador, where you can get paid work on community projects for 6 months, but that also provides technical training and labor market orientation through linkages. Similarly, in Chile, the conditional cash transfer is combined with basic psychological support and a labor insertion plan for each household that's receiving the CCT. In Peru, targeting particular services at recipients of the CCT households. And you'll notice that I'm not trying to pronounce the Spanish names here. We'll ask the experts to do that for us at a different point. So it targets family production systems, healthy housing, inclusive rural businesses, and financial education at the beneficiaries of the CCT. 3 other examples here. In Mexico, Prospera, beneficiaries are prioritized to join certain programs of vocational training, to benefit from certain advantageous financial inclusion programs, and in the case of youth, to complete higher education. Brazil also has a program to try to coherently integrate the social protection and production initiatives within the country. And finally, in Colombia, youth life skills, higher education, and technical training aimed particularly at beneficiaries of Red Unidos and other social programs in the country. So some very exciting initiatives here around making the linkages between social protection on the other hand and labor market policy on the other. We also are very fortunate that among the participants in this knowledge exchange, we have a range of different profiles, people from government, both in terms of the policy side and in terms of practitioners, both from national and from subnational levels. Development partners, NGOs, technicians, researchers, even a few consultants. So I think there are lots of lessons being learnt, and there are a number of very knowledgeable experts, and we're lucky to have a lot of you with us here today, but they're geographically and institutionally dispersed. And the purpose of this knowledge jam is to try to dig out that knowledge and to turn it into common action. And that's what we hope to do over the next couple of days. How will we do it? Well, the way we intend to structure this next couple of days is to start from this point of view that social protection is about providing an acceptable standard of living to those unable to support themselves through decent work and preventing transitory shocks from having permanent consequences. Social protection is not about providing employment, but it can help in a couple of important areas. It can help to improve the employability of beneficiaries, and it can help to foster the systems that create employment opportunities. And we're going to take those two headings, subdivide them, and work in different groups to explore each one of these areas in a bit more detail. So, in terms of building the capacity of beneficiaries, we need to look at developing soft skills, building vocational skills, and nurturing enterprise skills. And there are just some examples of the kinds of things, the kind of topics that we're going to be discussing under each of those three headings. As I say, those are not the answers, that's not a complete list. This is just some examples to guide our discussions. We will be expanding on this over the next couple of days. The second main heading is in this area of linking of systems, where what we're hoping to do is to look at how we can build the capacity for collaboration with other interventions. And I think there are three areas here. The first one is around a better understanding of the beneficiaries, better knowing the beneficiaries, because if you're going to help them with these kind of linkages, you need to have a better understanding, not just of the fact that they are poor, but of the fact that they have particular capacities, particular abilities, particular backgrounds. And so this idea of needing to know more about the beneficiaries, and there are some very interesting examples of this. Understanding local markets. If you're going to be encouraging people either to go into the labor market or to engage with produce markets, then you need to have much better understanding at a much lower level of the kinds of markets that exist and the opportunities that exist. How do you go about that? And I think that's a very important question. And finally, how do we link to these other services, which are not social protection, but which can have a big impact on people and on their welfare? So how do we build those linkages with other government programs, with other NGO programs, or whatever it might be? So over the next 2 days, we have these two working sessions where we first look at that first topic, building capacity of beneficiaries, in 3 different groups. And then tomorrow morning, looking at that second area of building capacity for collaboration and those 3 further working groups.